for these purposes. We began these book talks years ago in a very modest way, and we did them on site. And we thought we would have a good crowd. If we got 25, 30, 35 occasionally, we would get a few more than that. But during the pandemic, we have discovered that Zoom is the way to reach out. And as everybody was waiting, asked people to comment on chat where you're from. And we saw people responding from all over the country. I'm not sure I picked up on an international participant yet, but I know that we sometimes have international participants. So wherever you are with us from, I want to welcome you. Tonight is really a spectacular way for us to begin our season with a distinguished scholar and author, and with a book about one of the most important figures of 20th century American and world Judaism. I think that's fair to say. And his impact continues into our century, and I have no doubt will continue into the future. So let me just begin with my official introduction of the author, and then add a couple of words. Julian Zelizer has been among the pioneers in the revival of American political history. He is the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes Class of 1941 Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University, and a CNN political analyst and regular guest on NPR's Here and Now. He's the author and editor of 22 books, including The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society, 2015. He's here to speak about his new book, published by Yale University Press, which, as you know, is a biography of Abraham Joshua Heschel for the Yale Jewish Life series. This is a really special series. There have been other series of Jewish biographies before. What distinguishes this is that the invited authors are not necessarily experts in their field. They're invited to step in and discover and express, their sense of discovery, amazement, appreciation, whatever the range of discovery that a scholar diving into the life of a distinguished individual might be. And that is certainly going to be part of what we hear tonight. It's crucial to add, Julian made sure that I would know this, or would be reminded of it. I knew it, but be reminded of it and share with you that his father, Gerald, and his grandfather, Nathan, were both rabbis who were graduates of JTS, and he is therefore a member of our family. Julian, the floor is yours. Let me just, before you begin, indicate that everyone please stay on mute. I will, if somebody strays off of mute, I will come back and mute you so that there's no audio distraction. I would ask you please on chat to keep your comments during the presentation to questions that you might want to ask at the end. Please don't use it for conversation because it can distract the author. And we will have a period after the author's presentation during which time you will be able to ask questions. Please put them on chat. I will gather them from the chat function and articulate them out loud when the time comes. So I've got a request for live transcript. I am going to enable that now as well. So I hope that's working properly. And Julian, go right ahead. It's so great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for setting this up, David. And it's wonderful to be part of this series, and it's wonderful to be able to speak to all of you. I've learned over the last year and a half that Zoom is not good for many things, but for giving talks and being able to broaden our community on subjects like new books and different research topics, it's actually has a lot of advantages. And I wanted to start with the iconic photograph that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is how I start the book, which was taken on March 21st, 1965, as Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, with his long white beard and his overflowing curly hair, can be seen walking arm in arm with prominent civil rights activists from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. Bearing a proud smile, Heschel, who is a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, is marching in solidarity next to a more solemn-looking Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who's to his left, and Nobel Peace Prize winner Ralph Bunche to his right. You can see in the photograph a nun who's on the other end.
Julian, do you mean to be sharing your screen? Because I don't see it shared.
I'm just describing it.
Oh, okay. Just wanted to make sure.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Don't worry. You can see a nun on the other side of the line who's holding civil rights activist John Lewis, whose skull had been fractured by Alabama state troopers just a few weeks earlier on March 7th during another march, which became known as Bloody Sunday. You can see Heschel with his right hand tucked into the midsection of his dark jacket as they are about to walk over some sort of shadow. The clashes that had taken place 2 weeks earlier, which had been captured on national television and on the front pages of newspapers as they unfolded on the Edmund Pettus Bridge before this photograph was shot, loomed large on the eyes and in the minds of all marchers as they marched in support of a voting rights bill that would protect the rights of African Americans to vote. This was what moved Heschel to fly down south and accept King's invitation to join him and a group of preachers, rabbis, and others who were showing solidarity for the cause. Selma was, of course, cathartic for Heschel, who many civil rights leaders were now calling Father Abraham, as he came to realize that, quote, many human beings are serving as one in a sacred cause. Civil rights activist Andrew Young recalled that the march put Heschel in the, quote, category of himself being one of the prophets and not just an academic, that he was a scholar, but actually, I mean, it was quite significant for somebody of his stature. Generally, academics are not committed to action, yet time and time again he was. And Heschel famously recounted, I felt my legs were praying. I've spent the last few years diving into the archives of Heschel's work, of his career, of his life, which are located at Duke University. It's been an absolutely fascinating process as a historian of 20th century America to look at these incredibly rich materials. I've benefited from the work of so many scholars, Edward Kaplan, Sam Dresner, Shai Held, Michael Marmer, Arnie Eisen, and of course, Susanna Heschel, as I tried to put this story together and connect it to the bigger story of American religious life and American politics since World War II. I start the book with Heschel growing up in the Hasidic world of Warsaw, coming from a family of very prominent rabbis, moving through his doctoral education at the University of Berlin, where he studied philosophy, to the years between 1940 and 1945, when he's rescued and comes to the United States and moves to Cincinnati, where he works at the Hebrew Union College and has many difficult years struggling to rectify some of what he was witnessing with American Judaism, and also, of course, living through World War II and the Holocaust, which took the lives of his mother and 3 of his sisters. Following Heschel as he moves to the institution hosting this talk, the Jewish Theological Seminary, and looking at the 1940s and 50s, when he becomes a major voice on exploring issues such as spirituality, piety, the relationship between God and man, and is part of a group of religious public intellectuals, many of whom are working in New York City during these post-war decades, and gaining a lot of attention, even in magazines like Time Magazine and Newsweek. And the book culminates, of course, in the last 2 chapters with his work as a social activist, as he takes many of the ideas and thoughts that had inspired him and that he had worked on throughout his life. And this leads him to the streets, whether it was being in Selma, protesting for voting rights, or mobilizing to protect Soviet Jewry, dealing with anti-Semitic doctrine, from the Catholic Church, or in the last 5-6 years of his life, fighting against the war in Vietnam. It's really a remarkable life. It was truly a pleasure to spend so much time with Heschel. And my hope with the book is to recapture the life of one of the most most influential Jewish lives in the United States, but also to place his story and American Jewish history in broader context. Too often, all of us know fields and specialties get siloed from each other. And too often, stories that are taking place in one area are not connected and integrated into broader narratives that we have about the country. So I wanted to bring out the connections between an institution such as the Jewish Theological Seminary and really Jewish New York in the 1940s and 50s. And where did this fit in early Cold War America? I wanted to understand the threads between what Jewish activists like Heschel and others were doing when they got involved in the civil rights movement and the broader constellation of interfaith activism that was so important and often so forgotten during these critical years. And finally, before I go into some specific parts of the book, I'd be remiss if there wasn't a personal connection in this book. I've written about many subjects: Lyndon Johnson, the politics of national security. My last book was about Newt Gingrich, but this one was very different. As David said, my father is a graduate of JTS. Many of you know Jerry Zelizer. My grandfather, Nathan Zelizer, was as well. So I grew up with JTS, with figures such as Heschel, and with Judaism during this period, always as a part of my life. Their lives intersected with Heschel's world, and conservative Judaism is a very important part of who I am. So for me to be able to bring the skills I have as a professional historian to bear on a study of this period was really, really wonderful. So I just wanted to talk a little bit tonight about a few of the ways in which I found Heschel's story, besides being just an amazing, fascinating study of an immigrant who ends up on the front pages of newspapers like the New York Times, what are some of the ways in which it speaks to questions that we're grappling with today that are very relevant in the year 2021? I found again and again that his story offered a window into discussing and thinking about pertinent issues to our community, which was part of the joy of sharing this book with the public. One way in which I found it relevant was that during his time at JTS, during the early decades at JTS, he was one of many giant figures who were at that institution who were engaged in conversations about the nature of Jewish institutions and how to best ensure that American Judaism not just survives, but thrives in the contemporary era, one where the lure of assimilation, of commercial culture, of all the materialistic needs that were coming to be very pronounced in suburban America were competing often with Jewish tradition and Jewish theology. And this is a question that we continue to discuss today. Obviously, when the Pew studies come out about some of the distance between American Jews and core institutions and values, this debate is front and center. And so looking back at the 40s and 50s is very instructive because a lot of those debates are going on back then. Of course, attachment to the tradition was still much stronger back then, but coming out of the destruction of so much of European Jewry in World War II, and at this moment of grand expectations for our economy and the world of commerce, JTS became the site of a very vigorous and often incredibly contentious debate about how to make sure that Judaism did well in the modern era, with debates we're still having today. There were, of course, figures such as Mordechai Kaplan, who were emphasizing the centrality and role of the synagogue as an institution that could become the basis for promoting and nurturing a social culture and network and fabric for American Jews. Scholars such as Saul Lieberman were producing monumental work in the 20th century about Jewish law, halakha, as the fabric that would hold us together. And then there was Heschel, who was somewhat of an outlier at the time, writing about issues of spirituality and piety and how this fit into the world of the individual Jew. And this is captured in almost all of his writing already. When you look at a book like Earth is the Lord's, which came out in 1949, you see a eulogy for a lost world of spiritual Jewish life from the early 20th century, where, as he said, quote, "The stomachs were empty, the homes were barren, but the minds were crammed with the riches of Torah that was increasingly vanishing." This was a theme that was very much essential to part of what he was trying to do in his book, The Sabbath, published in 1951, where he's trying to offer a way for readers to understand how and why Jews sanctify time in a week that's filled with the demands of commerce, work, and materialism. That book really resonates when it comes out, and the United Synagogue of America interestingly distributes the book as part of something that was called the Sabbath Observance Project in 1951 and 1952. And in other places, I go over some of his famous writing and speeches where he puts pressure on rabbis to focus more on teaching Jews to pray rather than just imploring them to do so. One of the most controversial moments some of you might be familiar with took place at the Breakers Hotel in June of 1953 during one of the conventions, with Mordechai Kaplan sitting in the office, when Heschel criticized the modern synagogue with a critique that he would continue with through much of his life. He said, quote, "Our services are conducted with pomp and precision. The rendition of the liturgy is smooth. Everything is present. Decorum, voice, ceremony. But one thing is missing," he said, "life." He continues, "One knows in advance what will ensue. There will be no surprise, no adventure of the soul. There will be no sudden burst of devotion. Nothing is going to happen to the soul. Nothing unpredictable must happen to the person who prays." And in one of the most famous lines that got attention in the media, he asks, "Has the synagogue become the graveyard where prayer is buried?" And I found this element of his work and of his career very relevant, as today the Jewish community struggles and debates what to do with declining affiliation and declining attachment to many of the core institutions that have been so central to American Judaism. My father once said in a sermon that his father's generation of Jews built institutions. My father's generation filled them, and now the current generation is finding reasons to keep people attached. And I think this is very relevant in looking back at some of the arguments that he was trying to make about prayer, about the life of the Jewish individual and community. Teaching why Sabbath has meaning, why we pray before we eat food, how to pray and how to be in the proper spirit, have the proper kavanah to conduct the mitzvot, are all incredibly important. While people disagree about what he said and even how he said it, I think the debate that he put on the table, so controversial in the 40s and 50s, is very important to examine once again. A second place in which Heschel's story was very interesting, and it's why I started my talk tonight with that picture, is the role of progressive religious politics in the 1960s. Since the 1970s, conservatism and religion have converged. When many people talk about the role of religion in politics, they think about the religious right. They think about the moral majority. Figures such as Jerry Falwell have certainly overtaken figures such as Heschel in the public imagination. And even within Judaism, the ways in which questions and debates about Israel have eclipsed other kinds of political questions, have marginalized some of the world that was so vibrant in 1960s America, where it was not surprising to find rabbis and preachers marching on the front lines of social justice issues. We clearly have those voices today. Within Judaism, Rabbi Jill Jacobs of Trua has become a very important, influential figure. Reverend William Barber, who heads the Poor People's Campaign and Moral Mondays, has also been an important figure. But as they themselves would say, they have kind of a much more marginal place than you saw in the 1960s. The place of progressive religious politics was fascinating as I look back into this decade, very different than what we see today. Religion played such an important role in 1960s politics. And what's interesting about Heschel is that he is not just a Jewish person involved in social justice issues, but he really saw and understood deep connections between what Judaism was about and what social justice struggles were trying to achieve. Auschwitz is a manifestation of what a world without God is capable of doing, he said. Much of his writing connected to this particular question, and he started to draw some of the connections when he publishes his book, The Prophets. The notion that there is a God with pathos who needed pious humans to be able to open themselves up to hearing God and to being able to express God's anger and love for the world was quite integral. More than simply the notion of tikkun olam, everything about the Jewish religion ultimately informed what he was doing as an activist. And I think this was true of many of the figures who we worked with during this time. At some level, Heschel believed that one couldn't be truly religious without rejecting some of the worst forms of reactionary politics in that decade. Certainly, that's what he believed about racism. When he made a speech in January of 1963 to an interfaith conference on religion and race, where he had been invited by Martin Luther King, and it was the first time the two really spent some time together, Heschel delivered a speech in which he got a standing ovation, in which he said, to think of man in terms of white, black, or yellow is more than an error. It is an eye disease, a cancer of the soul. A person couldn't be religious and racist since, quote, racial or religious bigotry must be recognized for what it is, he said, Satanism, blasphemy. My book tries to look at his career more as an evolution than periods that are separate, meaning all the work that he did in his writing during the 1940s and 50s and his upbringing, even as a Hasidic Jew in Warsaw, ultimately informed what he was doing in the last decade of his life. Even looking back at books such as God in Search of Man, you can see him starting to work out ideas he would continue to talk about when his attention had shifted. Obviously, the place in which this was most evident was the Hebrew prophets, which came out right as the civil rights movement was accelerating and becoming the national issue in 1962 and 1963. And that's the book where he, of course, wrote, above all, the prophets remind us of the moral state of the people. Few are guilty, but all are responsible. The prophets, he said, couldn't help but see what so many people ignored or took for granted. Our standards are modest, he wrote, our sense of injustice tolerable, timid, our moral indignation impermanent, yet human violence is interminable, unbearable, permanent. To us, life is often serene. In the prophet's eye, the world reels in confusion. Another interesting element of this was the way in which he started to see how by being at the center of this world and starting to connect Judaism to the social activism of the period, it was in fact a way to sometimes engage people who had become disengaged. There's a scene in my book after the march in Selma where he's going to the airport and he meets a young Reform Jewish man who's working for King. and who drives him and Wolf Kellman to the airport so that they can return. And the young man says he didn't really identify with Judaism and with religion at all, but after the march in Selma, his eyes were open. And upon hearing the story, Heschel thought to himself, Jewish religious institutions have again missed a great opportunity, namely to interpret the civil rights movement in terms of Judaism. The vast numbers of Jews participating actively in it are totally aware of what the movement means in terms of the prophetic traditions. Heschel's activism and that of many other religious figures in the Jewish community and in other faith traditions really contributed a moral dimension to the activism of that period. His work fighting the war against Vietnam with figures like John Bennett of the Union Theological Seminary, William Sloane Coffin, the Berrigan brothers, and others really demonstrated kind of the moral weight that faith-based leaders could bring to these kinds of fights. And as we are now in a period where there are so many social justice questions front and center, from race relations to the state of the environment, to reproductive rights, to much more, I think looking back at this period opens up some windows that are very helpful. Finally, the third place in which I think his story is just interesting to look back at in our current age is the importance to him of interfaith outreach, dialogue, and conversation. At a moment when we see so many fault lines forming and hardening between different religions, as well as even within Judaism, he is a breath of fresh air in his commitment and devotion to speaking across these sorts of divides. His life and his work and his writing and his activism are all worth looking back on as one model of how this could be done and how we could think a different way about religions. And this feels quite urgent. Heschel, of course, was steadfast in the importance of this kind of dialogue when he started his position as a visiting professor at the Union Theological Seminary. He gave a famous address, No Religion is an Island, where he said the religions of the world are no more self-sufficient, no more independent, no more isolated than individuals or nations. Energies, experiences, and ideas that come to life outside the boundaries of a particular religion or all religions continue to challenge and to affect every religion. We fail to realize, he wrote, that while different exponents of faith in the world of religion continue to be wary, there is another movement worldwide in extent and influence, nihilism. We must choose between interfaith and inner nihilism. Cynicism is not parochial. Should religions insist upon the illusion of complete isolation? Should we refuse to be on speaking terms with another and hope for each other's failure? Or should we pray for each other's health and help one another in preserving one's respective legacy, in preserving a common legacy? And we see this throughout his career. This becomes very pronounced in the review that comes out of Man is Not Alone in the New York Herald, when Reinhold Niebuhr, who's one of the major voices of this period, helps to put Heschel on the national map by writing a very favorable review and saying Heschel will become a commanding and authoritative voice, not only in the Jewish community, but in the religious life of America. We see it in Heschel's determination to take up the call of working in secret negotiations with the Vatican between 1962 and 65, despite the opposition of many Jewish leaders to entering in these kind of theological discussions to try to remove doctrine that had been so central to anti-Semitic thought. And you really see it as well in his work during the Vietnam War, where his history and his background with other faiths become the reason that he can help form an interfaith group that really looms quite large during this period and is an important part of the anti-war movement. And again, it's not simply about the relationship of Jews to other religions, but he's also just interesting, as many of you know, because he's in a period where there's so much more fluidity between different parts of Judaism. Some of the divisions that Sam Friedman later wrote about in a book, Jew versus Jew, weren't quite there. And there was space for someone who grew up as a Hasid to teach in the Jewish Theological Seminary, to interact and be in conversation with many different kinds of Jewish leaders by the end of his life, that I think is worth looking back on. So those are some of the reasons that I think his story, besides just being a fascinating and inspiring biography, are also quite relevant in our times with all the challenges that we face here in the United States and all over the world. Before I open the floor to questions on Zoom, David had asked if I perhaps wanted to read just a little bit of the book, so I thought I would. I'm just going to read a small section from the part where I write about the actual march in Selma, and it's based on just some really great documentation in the archives where he narrated in a diary form some of what was happening and what he was feeling. So let me read a little bit of that, and then I'm happy to discuss. When Heschel moved toward, so now the march is about to start. When Heschel moved toward the front, one onlooker shouted out, "There goes God." For much of the march, the participants were silent. They had been instructed to avoid saying anything that could trigger violence. There was a spirit of pleasantness and solemnity, Heschel said. No militants, no bitterness. A feeling of solidarity prevailed many hearts, somehow transcending the difficulties and the problems of the moment. It was as if we were moved by a vision, he noted. He walked along US 80 arm in arm with Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and Ralph Bunch, standing just a few persons over from King, with 3,000 peaceful protesters behind them. Heschel was dressed in a black overcoat and wore a Hawaiian lei around his neck, a symbol of love, which all the marchers were wearing. His long tousled hair was overflowing. One rabbi, Maurice Davis, recalled that during the protest, Heschel, quote, never wilted and never showed anger, even when the police drove by taking movies of us, as if to tell us that they had all of our faces on record. The procession brought back memories, reminding Heschel of the walks he had taken with Hasidic rabbis in Warsaw who, quote, felt a sense of holy in what I was doing. Remaining silent in those fraught hours was not easy. The notorious sheriff, Jim Clark, who had directed the brutal crackdown on protesters a few weeks earlier, stood in intimidating fashion, wearing his famous pin, the lapel that said "never" on his blue police suit. White onlookers brandished the Confederate flag and screamed all sorts of anti-Semitic and racist words as they walked by. Heschel was shocked to see white Southern women spitting on the nun who was walking right near him. As Rabbi Saul Lehman, a conservative rabbi from Rhode Island, recounted, we could say we were not extended any Southern hospitality. As we marched, there were federal troops on each side of the road with their rifles in hand. There were some helicopters hovering above. We felt as if we were in enemy territory. The march took place without incident. Despite the hostile crowds, over 1,800 Alabama National Guardsmen and approximately 2,000 soldiers, federal marshals, and FBI agents this time protected the marchers. Although the march would go on for 54 miles in 5 days, reaching 25,000 participants, Heschel and a number of some of the prominent figures on day one, they took buses back to Selma, Montgomery, and then they drove to the airport. Heschel felt that he had been involved in something much grander than himself. He noted the hundreds of African Americans who he saw wearing yarmulkes, which they called freedom caps. He was touched by the response of the Jews who he met along the way. And I told you the story of the young Reform Jew who he met. Heschel's excitement was tempered, though, by some of the behavior of the white Southerners who he had witnessed. In his diary, he records that the waitress at the airport dismissively referred to him and Kelman as "you people." The waitress said that her mother told her Santa Claus existed, but she never believed her until seeing Heschel. "I ordered tea, I received half a cup," he wrote. "I ordered a hard-boiled egg, it could have been out of archaeology. The piece of cheese was like thin paper and stale." Still, even in this fraught moment, he managed to find humor. When the waitress glowers at him, asking, "What favor did you do me?" Heschel responds, I proved there was a Santa Claus." Selma was cathartic for Heschel, whom the civil rights activists were calling, as I said, Father Abraham, and who came to realize that many human beings were, quote, "serving as one in a sacred cause." These hours marching tilted the balance of his life toward fully embracing the new role he had been undertaking in the first half of the 1960s as an intellectual activist. "I felt that anyone who participated in this march will never be the same. It was a great day in my life," he wrote. And Heschel then famously recounted, "I felt my legs were praying." Thank you.
Beautiful. Let me just add myself to the screen so that I can be seen. And let me begin with the questions that I'm sure are most urgent for people right now. The first one is, how can they get the book? Obviously, people know how to obtain books these days, but do you have a recommended path that you would prefer?
I love real bookstores, meaning physical bookstores. If there's one near you, I always urge you to go. I think they have it in most bookstores. Bookshop is a great online independent book chain. Of course, Amazon will get it for you very quickly, and I think you can order it through Yale Press, but the preference is whatever you have. But if you happen to live near a bookstore, try to give them your business. It's always great, and that's my recommendation. But it's available everywhere.
I support that recommendation. Okay, and the second question before I actually opened up to questions, the scene you just painted now was so vivid and so beautiful, inspirational even. Your way of describing it, the language really captured it. What I always wonder when I'm reading Heschel, his first language was not English, yet his books are, if not pure poetry, then largely poetry. His command of the English language is just extraordinary. As a second or third language, I don't know how he would count it. He writes far better than most of us would ever be able to. Do you have an insight into that? Can you comment on that?
I mean, look, part of it was a skill and talent with language. He showed this his whole life. And before English, he was already pretty conversant with multiple languages. And I think English was part of that trajectory. He had different people along the way who tutored him in English. There is one great story when he was at Hebrew Union College in the early 1940s. Someone named Herbert Drews tutored him in English in exchange for Heschel tutor him in Hebrew. And Heschel he liked to read like Lincoln's addresses and all sorts of Melville and classic American texts. And I found Drews recounted in this story how one day Heschel said to him, he was all excited, Heschel, and he's like, Drews was like, "Why are you so excited?" He said, "I dreamt in English." And I think kind of there was also a proactive learning, but a lot of it was natural. Earth is the Lord's is pretty early still. I mean, it's coming out just a few years really after Cincinnati, after he had moved here. And it's written very in that beautiful language already. So his proficiency is pretty striking.
Yeah, it's remarkable. Okay, we have several questions that I would put under the category of Heschel and, without the specific formulation of our questioners. But one of our listeners wanted to know about Heschel and the Soviet Jewry movement, another about Heschel and Zionism, and a third about Heschel and anti-Semitism. So just to repeat it, Heschel and Soviet Jews, why don't you begin there, then Heschel and Zionism, and Heschel and anti-Semitism.
Sure, and if I forget the third, just remind
me. I will
me
fill it in for you. Right?
The Soviet Jewry is a big part of the book, and it was really fascinating. He's involved in this very early on. I mean, the movement, as we come to know it, really doesn't totally flourish and take shape until the early 1970s. But by the early 1960s, there are a number of Jews who are involved in this. There's a group in Cleveland, Ohio, that forms a committee that's starting to try to get attention for this. There's a famous article in Foreign Affairs magazine that starts to give national attention to this question. And then there's leaders like Abraham Ribicoff in Washington, Arthur Goldberg, some people who surround Lyndon Johnson eventually, who are also concerned. And Heschel's involved in a lot of these conversations. He gives a number of sermons where he's pretty tough in controversial ways. He gives some in the early 60s, another in 66, where he condemns American Jewish leaders, including rabbis, for not doing enough on this question. I found several letters where other people in this early stage of the movement kind of compliment him as someone who's talking about this all the time, giving voice to it. Martin Luther King even starts to speak about it at events they're in together. There's a great letter where Heschel asks, they're doing something together, and Heschel says, is it okay to take a little time to talk about this in addition to civil rights? And King responds, of course. He sees the kind of confluence between the two issues. So Elie Wiesel, who will publish an important book, credits Heschel with awakening him to this issue. So this was very important. He saw it always in the shadow of World War II, meaning during the war, I talk about some early activism he's engaged with. And he was frustrated with the American Jewish community for not doing enough on Jewish refugees. So when the Soviet issue comes up, he's often talking about, we can't repeat what we did back then. We can't repeat that mistake. He also connects it to the civil rights struggle and says, if we are doing this on the question of race, we also have to do it for Jews living under the Iron Curtain. So it's an important part of that activism that I wanted to bring back and connect to the other questions. Heschel is a Zionist. Zionism is important to him. Israel is important to him early on. He takes his first trip in 1957 with his family there. And then obviously in 1967, he finds himself at odds with many of the anti-war activists of the period, because he defends Israel and defends the right of Israel to defend itself. There's many anti-war leaders who are more critical of Israel, and they're telling him, how can you support Israel's acquisition of land when it's the same kind of thing we're protesting? And he stays firm. He publishes a book about this where he kind of offers a defense. You know, his Zionism is connected to the place of Israel, I would say first, in Jewish history, in the creation of the Jewish people, as opposed to just a political project. I think he sees Israel after its creation also as part of a project to renounce hatred, meaning it is in many ways an effort to respond to what anti-Semitism and racial hatred wrought during World War II. Finally, I think his bigger concern was the health, though, of the Jewish people rather than the health of Israel. And he famously would say, you know, are the Jewish people worthy of the state? That's really the question. And a lot of what he did, while he is a Zionist and is in love, he loves Israel, it doesn't define a lot of what he's doing. It's really kind of interesting. I think part of that's generational. It's not just him, but he was really most focused on the spiritual state of the Jewish people, and then the social human rights issues globally. And Israel was part of his life rather than defining it.
Before you go on, my understanding is that he got some response, some blowback after publishing The Sabbath, in which he, said, Judaism is a religion of time and not space, and it could be taken as an anti-space polemic even. And some people, responded and said, well, this sounds anti-Zionist to us. Is there any merit to that?
I mean, the criticism is, I've read it and I've seen it not that way, more of a criticism intellectual, meaning here's a book, it comes out in 1951, so a few years after the State of Israel. But I don't know. Given kind of what he would continue to say about Israel, and the kind of true admiration's the wrong word, but love is the word I think characterizes it more, that he continues to have. I don't read that book that way. And I think that difference is a criticism of interpretation, is a better way to put it.
One here that was written for Thomas.
I think someone's unmuted.
I hear that someone has unmuted.
I'm hearing
themselves,
voices,
and I'm gonna go and mute them. There they are. Okay.
So I didn't read it that way, nor did I find evidence that is what the book is intended to be.
Okay.
And I think that the really interesting part of the Sabbath, if you read it again, is, I mean, there's a whole conversation in American intellectual history of this period of this emerging consumer culture in this country. And there's a bunch of people, intellectuals in the city where he was working, who are very critical of what this is going to do, the way suburbanization is going to flatten American life, the way in which a concern with material goods, two-car garage, TV is going to sap us as a country of some of what we are. And there, you can look in the book, and I think it's a dialogue with that. And he's talking about Shabbat, the Sabbath, as this time away from that. And I don't have the quotes right in front of me, but that's the conversation I think that interested him. Okay. And anti-Semitism, it's something that is on his mind all the time. It haunts him. And this is someone who is profoundly impacted by what happens in World War II. He saw it before the war as he was in Berlin. He saw it when he's kicked out by the Gestapo. He sees it when he has trouble publishing his dissertation because he is a Jewish author. He sees it during the war. And anti-Semitism, is a profoundly vile form of hatred that in many ways embodies bigger forms or other forms of social hatred as well that are going on around him. There are moments, someone asked me about the book once, in 1968, there's tensions are starting to flare already between some Black activists and kind of Jewish civil rights activists, some about schooling here in New York. The Black Power movement is increasingly critical of Israel. And so these questions which we hear today come up. And Heschel's, he's very kind of insistent that those tensions should not define the relationship. And in the end, kind of there is one moment where anti-Semitism flare where he pushes back and says, that's not the defining part of our relationship. But that aside, overall, I think this is really something he's wrestling with. And he's wrestling, sorry to go on, he's wrestling with the question of where does it come from? And I mean, I think a lot of his work that he's trying to go through in the 1950s with these books is wrestling with the question of, in this world of science and modernity, what happens if the spiritual kind of core is not there anymore? And I think part of the answer is that Auschwitz quote I said, is that's where this stuff rears. So his life work is an effort to fight back against it, not just by being on the streets, but by teaching people and helping them have a moral weight, all of us, so that won't exist.
Okay, somebody is interested in, I don't know if this is a question about gossip, but I'll de-gossipize it and just make it as it says, wants to know about Heschel and his relationship with his colleagues at JTS. What can you say about that? Yeah,
I mean, that comes up when you study Heschel. There's certain friction for sure between him and colleagues and some students. Some of it kind of manifests itself in personal ways. Some of it is about differences with what he was doing versus what they were doing. There's a moment when he's walking with Wolf Kelman and he's frustrated because of some of the criticism he's hearing about his work. And Kelman's like, what do you expect? You're challenging a lot of what they do. This is what's going to happen. And so there's tons of personal gossip. Anyone on the Zoom who kind of knew Heschel, knew the institution of that period, the friction existed. I mean, I mention it, but it's not central in the story I wanted to tell. What did interest me were the intellectual tensions. Seeing this not simply as not liking Heschel or disrespect for Heschel, but this really vibrant debate I saw at JTS with these giants of Kaplan, Lieberman, and others, and Heschel, about American Judaism during this period and in this era, and questions from halakha to the synagogue, and I kind of looked at it through that. In the end, that was what interested me much more. Look, there are lots of tensions at JTS. People talk about tensions with him, but the more I studied, I saw there are lots of figures, who were in fights with all sorts of people, and there were differences with students. It was an era of giants. They had big ideas, and I think that contention took different forms. But that was the way I deal with it in the book.
Okay, I mean, makes sense. Tensions are endemic to academic and religious institutions, right?
Because of my work, I know this all the time. I mean, I see it, yes. And it's not unimportant. It just, for me, it wasn't as central as the kind of divisions of thought that he really was part of, and that debate over ideas.
Mm-hmm. Now, during your presentation, you used the phrase "the moral weight of faith-based leaders," and you did comment briefly on the question of whether there is such a leadership today. I'm going to change the question a little bit about the possibility of such leadership today. Could such a leadership emerge given the world in which we find ourselves, given the conditions that define our public culture? What do you think about that? Could there be another Heschel is another way of saying this.
I think there could. I mean, I do think, I think there is a bigger world, whether you support it or not, of progressive politics and a kind of generational expansion of this realm of politics that we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years, which is quite striking. And it's not just progressive politics, it's younger people who are more interested in questions such as environmental justice and environmental protection than older generations. And I think, religion still is a very important part of the body of this nation. And this is a little different than Heschel. One of the really interesting parts of religion and politics is the way these religious leaders were important in pretty conservative areas of the country. So when civil rights was coming up in a place like Illinois, preachers had the ability to persuade congregants in a way a civil rights leader never could. And I think that still can happen today. And I gave some examples of people who are doing it. And because of the nature of the media today, there's lots more opportunity. It's so fragmented. And we talk about the bad parts of the media all the time, but the good part is it's fragmented. There's room for different voices. And I think this can be a growing part of the political realm. And the final thing is, I mean, a lot of conservative political leaders have become part of the political establishment. They've almost derooted themselves from the church or derooted themselves from where they started. They have lobbies, they're a machine. And so that creates space for other kinds of political voices. So I wouldn't be surprised to see more William Barbers, more Jill Jacobs in the years ahead.
Phyllis asks a question that I'm going to allow to be my last before making some final comments. And this is an opportunity for you again to promote your book. There have been several books on Heschel. What's different about yours?
Yeah, I mean, the books that are on Heschel are fantastic, and I'm really indebted to them. The biggest thing is it's written from the perspective of a kind of mainstream US historian. And I look at his anti-war activism through the lens of someone who studied Vietnam to understand where does he fit in this bigger political picture. Same with civil rights. I also really, as I said, try to kind of show the through line between the different parts of his life rather than breaking them apart as separate things. And that was something I learned doing it as opposed to being predisposed to looking at it that way when I started. And finally, I was just able to kind of use amazing archival material which is the basis of the book. And some of the stories I shared and others, it comes out of firsthand accounts, which I think makes the book really exciting and fresh. But I see it as an addition to a lot of great work, part of a conversation with those scholars, but I hope that's some of what makes it distinct.
Okay, that's great. And of course, there will be more books on Heschel as well. So
there should be.
There should be, absolutely. I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm sure it will inspire many people to go out and read what you've said about Heschel and what others have said about Heschel. Everybody, I'd like to invite you back. This is, as I said, the beginning of a season. Next week, we have a book talk on Tuesday night from a new volume of the Posen Library of Jewish Civilization, going back to biblical times. So we go from the 20th century of the Common Era to as far back as the 20th century before the Common Era, or something like that. And I really do invite you to come. I'm sure that you'll learn a lot and hopefully enjoy it. And there will be many other programs. Because of our focus on Heschel tonight, I just want to also add that JTS, which was supposed to have an opening celebration for its new building and campus about a week after the pandemic began, is going to have instead, now that we are open and teaching classes with masks but in person, we are going to have an opening season in March and April into the beginning of May. And one of the programs that we are going to be running at that time, sponsored by the library, in fact, will be focused on a new documentary on Heschel and a discussion of a variety of interested scholars and others, asking the question, not what did Heschel do, but what would Heschel do? You know, if he were addressing, and Julian, you mentioned this, the kinds of questions that we are focusing on today, what would he ask us to do? It will include Susanna Heschel and others. It will be a wonderful program. So look for our announcements as we get closer to the springtime. Have a wonderful evening. Again, thanks for joining us. And I hope I'll see you at another book talk soon.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.